Call this meeting of the Finance Committee to order.
And call the meeting of the School Committee to order.
All right, and ask that we begin our meeting by pledging our allegiance to the flag. Purpose of tonight's meeting is presentation of the school department budget. And I know that there are a couple issues, I guess, I don't call them issues, but elements, I think, to the school department budget that are a little bit, I wouldn't say unusual, but a long time coming in terms of the funding and some serious reorganization in terms of putting forth the best educational program that you can. So the funding is interesting. It's a good news, bad news for communities like Winchendon. For a long time, the state has not funded correctly, taking into consideration some of the driving forces of minimum net school spending. And has underfunded schools in terms of minimum net school spending probably for the last 25 years. Most communities, many communities, let's put it that way, dealt with that issue by increasing their own contribution to the point where the average in the state is probably about 20% over the required net school spending. But the state is stepping up right now. They're increasing Chapter 70 and increasing the expectations for minimum net school spending, which again puts towns like Winchendon where there's very little room, unlike the 20% towns with about 1.5%. So we'll have to navigate that as we work through the next few years. I think that the work that the superintendent and the town manager have done to try to make this as equitable as possible, is an example of the kind of leadership that we need in the community to work through this. So I'll get off my soapbox and turn this over to Ryan, or turn this over to Superintendent King.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kane. For purposes of following through on our agenda, just a quick check to see if anyone is recording this meeting. They're not seeing any, and check to see if there is any public comment this evening. All right, from our massive audience here in the building, there is no public comment. Mr. Kane, thank you very much for your comments. The school committee is also very supportive of the superintendent and our new business manager, Ms. Babinski, in establishing a budget that we believe will serve the town and our community very well. To the point that Mr. Kane made a moment ago, the state of Massachusetts is in the process of adjusting the distribution of Chapter 70 funds after the passage of the Student Opportunity Act, which has not equally affected towns across the state of Massachusetts. Instead, Winchendon finds itself in the enviable position of receiving a greater proportion of Chapter 70 money than we have received in previous years because of the equity that is sought by the Student Opportunity Act. What that means is that you will see this evening a budget that has an increased contribution from the state, and that has provided us with the opportunity to do some creative and necessary things. As an example, you will see tonight that some of the very typical operating costs that a school system has have been pulled out of grant funds that are not reliable and not predictable, and instead put into the operating budget in a very prudent way. You will also see that the superintendent and the school committee have agreed on a number of very specific and intentional investments in the school district using the benefit of these increased funds in FY24 to invest in ways in the school that will support not only the school's strategic plan, but also the needs of the students in our district. And so we are very happy with the budget that you've seen, and certainly welcome any questions from the FinCom. And so we'll turn it over to Mr. King for any opening remarks, and then perhaps Ms. Babinski for a presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Forsyth, Mr. Kane. So a couple of quick notes. We're really happy to present a balanced budget here to the Finance Committee this evening. And I think just a few notes. We'll start with some budget priorities. Is that coming up on the screen in front of you as well? I don't know. But I think there's something else important to note, that the budget looks a little bit different in the way that you've received it this year than you've received in the past. And I think one of the things that's really important to note that we've discussed in these meetings over the past number of years is the chart of accounts and the way that the Department of Education likes to see or likes to track funds. We've not really done that terribly well in Winchendon in the past, and we're very fortunate that Ms. Babinski has come to us and understands chart of accounts, and we're moving to that model to help our end-of-year reporting. So it does explain, on the one hand, why it looks a little bit different this year. We're trying to be more in line with what the department does. It will help our end-of-year pieces. The other piece is, of course, that we are doing a large reorganization, so you'll see percentages in terms of changes from FY23 to FY24 that might look really out of whack. The reason for that is really the reorganization, and we really couldn't come up with an elegant way, if you will, to sort of really track that. So the numbers look extreme, but that's really as a result of moves of people. It's not necessarily increase in numbers or any of those types of things. The only increases in terms of full-time personnel will be explained here in the budget this evening. So with that, some of the budget priorities that we've gone through, or that we kind of set this budget on, first off is operations versus enrichment. And really for us, the big piece to that comes back to a couple of the trusts that we've relied on for so many years in this district from the school perspective, which is Murdoch Trust and the Robinson Broadhurst. We have used those funds historically for operational costs, quite literally paper, pens, pencil, literally operational costs in our day-to-day budgets in each of the buildings. We were very successful last year in taking Murdoch Trust out of removing funds from Murdoch Trust for operational expenses and moving those into enrichment. We moved those types of things into the budget in FY23. This year we did the same with Robinson Broadhurst. So those were moves that we had planned. We actually discussed with Robinson Broadhurst. It was received very well by them that we're going to use their funds for enrichment as opposed to recurring costs. And most specifically, the largest chunk out of Robinson Broadhurst has historically been a payment for our Chromebook initiatives, where every student has a Chromebook. We call it our one-to-one Chromebook initiative, and we've paid for that historically directly from Robinson Broadhurst to the tune of, let's call it $130,000 to $140,000 out of that $175,000 that are funded. So we've moved that into the general budget this year so that we can as well, and I think there's a slide, use all of those funds from Robinson Broadhurst for enrichment opportunities for our students.
So when you say enrichment across the board, or just a couple of schools, or across the district?
We're hitting, for all intents and purposes, we're trying to hit every grade level in a different way. In some places, as you're aware, we can only use Robinson Broadhurst or Murdoch Trust for certain grade levels. So tonight you'll see some things that we're using, for Robinson Broadhurst specifically.
So you can free up stuff for the other schools?
For the Murdoch Trust, exactly. Each of those trusts work a little bit differently, as I think most of you are aware, but we can speak to it for the folks at home. Robinson Broadhurst Trust works where we actually apply and tell them what we would like to spend the funds on, and they sort of authorize that or not. Murdoch Trust is very different. Murdoch Trust quite literally provides us a check each year, to which we're very grateful, but there are no requirements as how we spend that per se. We don't have to tell them ahead of time. So we give them kind of a report at the end of the year, and they're happy with how we spend that. So different processes that we follow. So we've moved all of those funds from both of those trusts now into 100% enrichment for our students in the district. And what we were prior using for operations from those are now in our operating costs within our Chapter 70 budget. So we're really excited. Over the course of 2 years, that's to the tune of, $350,000 to $380,000 or $90,000 we've moved into the general budget. So that was a large priority going into this year. It's really kind of a 2-year mission. We're also interested this year in maintaining our ongoing initiatives. So we've begun a lot of things in the district. over the past year or two. So we wanted to maintain those and that this budget is sustainable. So, sustainable model for our curriculum, our instructional improvement and leadership. We've invested a lot in that, and we were very clear in those last year. Those continue. Meeting the needs of students with our greatest challenges. These things also tie directly to that Student Opportunity Act. SOA money comes with some expectations of how you spend it. I mean, it is being given to us because we're underfunded in the high-need students. So the expectation is you spend it there. We began that last year, and that will continue this year as well. Parent and community engagement, and then supporting elementary math and literacy. So again, a Student Opportunity Act expectation is to spend the funds on early literacy, which is what we're doing and will continue to do. And you'll see that in this evening's budget as well. So those things started last year, and some of those we're continuing. As I mentioned, reserving the trust contributions for student enrichment, directly addressing special education needs. You'll see that we're addressing both tuition increases that are across the board that we have for out-of-district placements, as well as trying to improve our own special education department and addressing the needs of our students. And then maintaining as many of our ESSER-funded positions as allowable. So we've done, I feel we've done a very nice job of keeping salaries out of ESSER. I think when we began this, that was a real downfall of using ESSER funds. A lot of folks thought, you've got all this money, let's just hire people. That's not a sustainable model because ESSER funds were going to go away. We have, however, added a couple of folks, 4 that we thought would be short-term. Specifically, we added 2 COVID nurses a year ago. As you'll recall, we had a lot of COVID going on, and we had a lot of testing and so on. It was very needed. And we also added some adjustment counselors, thinking that was short-term. And I think if you ever even just browse headlines, you know that our students in general, not just in Winchendon, are somewhat dysregulated. We're struggling a lot with behaviors that are the outcome of COVID. We don't like to talk about COVID anymore, but the reality is students miss 2 years of school. And so if you think about a 5th grader today, they might more exhibit behaviors of a 3rd grader or so on. So we're really sort of addressing those things through what we thought were temporary positions. What we found now are more permanent needs. And so we've worked to move those into the general budget as well. And then as it states, really making sure that we're staying in line with what the Student Opportunity Act intended when they provided us those funds. You'll see at the end of the presentation as well exactly where we got about a 10% bump in our budget this year from the state. Typically, it's about 2%. It's the 2nd year in a row from SOA that we've received a 10%, which equates to about 1.2 or 1.8 million additional this year in our budget. And so you'll see at the very end of the presentation this evening exactly how that 1.8 is spent within the budget. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Babinski to give the rest of the presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to present the school budget for you. I know it is a...
Good.
Can you hear me there?
Yeah, I was going to say, you might need to speak a little closer to it, Amanda.
What's that? There we go. All right. I know it does look a little bit different. Would certainly hope to answer all your questions this evening. So please speak up. It is always nerve-wracking when you have 2 big things happening with the reorganization and the chart of accounts to do both at the same time. But we felt it was the right thing to do, and so that's how we're presenting it tonight. But certainly ask questions if some remain. The next slide here is our budget of assumptions. Unrestricted local aid, Chapter 70, are based on our current information from the state. We have received estimated cherry sheets and the initial budget from the governor's office. As you know, that continues to be approved throughout the state. Federal and state grant offsets are assumed to be funded at the same level as last year. You will notice a decrease on your summary page there. It will look very similar to your pre-COVID grant funding. So included in your grant levels are your entitlement grants. We are not anticipating any new additional ESSER funding or COVID relief type funds. We saw a significant increase in those amounts based on those grants. We do have a little bit of offset rollover included, but no new funding for grants.
Amanda, there's a big increase in circuit breaker. What's driving that?
Absolutely. So you're seeing a significant increase in your out-of-district student enrollment. And so the funding for circuit breaker last year, the claim, was pretty significant. And you actually had a majority of the students in private school settings. We have looked at our claim for what we will be claiming at the end of this year, and we'll actually see circuit breaker go down a little bit, despite the fact that some of our out-of-district costs are increasing. But the reason for that is what you're able to claim has to be above a certain threshold per student. So for example, if we have a student, this year it's about 49,000 is your net claim amount that's included in your foundation budget. So any expense that you spend on a student above the 49,000 is eligible for claiming with circuit breaker. Last year, because of the private school tuitions typically are in the 100,000s, you were able to claim the difference between the 49 and the, say, 130. So your claim was much higher. This year we have an increase in the collaborative slots. Those tend to be what we're seeing across the state as having more openings for students that are referred for out-of-district placements. So we will see next year's claim go down a little bit, but in general, the reason that for the very large increase is because you have an increase in out-of-district.
So it's the increase in the costs, the tuitions or out-of-district sped tuitions versus, or maybe some blend of, increase in the number of children who would, or students who would have programs that would supersede the threshold?
I would say both. For last year, it was really an increase in the number of students that superseded the amount. Next year, we're seeing a large increase in the rates for tuition.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Another budget assumption, special education tuition for private schools is increasing 14%. There's been a lot of legislation and talk about that. In Winchendon, we see a lot of students in collaboratives. We're not seeing a 14% increase in tuition for collaboratives, but it's about half, which is a substantially higher increase than previous years.
Can I just to clarify real quickly, so when we talk about these two things, private schools, we're talking about out-of-district placement, so meaning for everyone else, so meaning students who are our students but who need special placement, we don't provide the services. You've heard us reference private schools, and you've heard us reference collaboratives. There's a really different cost structure. So we belong to two collaboratives, and if we place a student in that particular one of those two collaboratives, I think the tuitions range, they're around $60,000?
Yes, anywhere from 45 to 65 is typically what we're seeing.
But where the private schools that we're referencing, I think we have at least one student that might be at the upward limit of $200,000 at a private school. So the tuitions are drastically different. So where we place students has a real impact on our special education costs, and and then that comes back around to how we can bill out for this circuit breaker, which is a reimbursement. So I just want to be really clear that there's a real difference between private out-of-district and cooperative out-of-placement.
Another reason that you may have seen such a large increase last year was also that districts are able to claim out-of-district transportation as well for claiming, and we are being reimbursed for some of our out-of-district transportation, which was not previously happening too. I think last year you claimed about $290,000 in special education out-of-district transportation, so that does help your claim.
Yeah, that showed up on the town revenues this year, the
Yes.
sped transportation reimbursement. Nobody seemed to know where it came from. But it's a significant amount of money, and certainly it makes sense it would come back to the town.
Correct. We're assuming that circuit breaker program will be funded at 75% reimbursement rate. All of our indirect costs are included as provided by the town. That was not included in your original packet, but we did pass out a handout tonight with those numbers. Health insurance rate increases about 7.5% for next year. All of the contractual obligations have been met for all associations and contracts. And we are estimating funding from the trust, Murdoch Trust, at $174,000, and Robinson Broadhurst application was $177,000. So Mr. King referenced the Robinson Broadhurst application earlier in the night. As you know, about $130,000 previously was spent on Chromebook, our one-to-one devices. So as you can see with next year's application, There's pretty significant experiences and opportunities for students in grades 3 to 8, as well as the continuation of the dual enrollment program at the high school.
So the intention of the enrichment sort of program here was very intentional around making sure that we hit each of the schools, each of the grades, that type of thing, and going out to actually the building principals and asking what type of experiences they'd like for their students. Some of these programs might look familiar in that we've done them in the past, but really the spirit of this is, you know, we're somewhat of an impoverished district, and we ask students to go fundraise to, you know, to go on a field trip. You know, they're going to their neighbor and the neighbor, you know, back and forth, and it just doesn't seem very logical, and it's a barrier for students to go on some really experiential learning, you know, sort of experiences. So we just took the initiative to say, let's not charge students for these pieces. Everybody's equal. Everybody should go and experience whatever the 8th grade, you know, DC trip that so many kids have experienced in general across the country that we haven't done here routinely over the past number of years, and so on. So you'll see those kind of throughout the grade levels and giving different experiences. We'll use, you know, Murdoch Trust possibly in different places as well to supplement, where we're supplementing with Murdoch Trust really as well to hit our music programming. We're doing a lot with instrumentation, making sure that students don't have to pay for instrument rentals, those types of things, so we can remove barriers to enter band program that we're trying to build up, that type of thing. And then we've doubled the value of our dual enrollment program. We're looking to expand our dual enrollment program, which Robinson Broadhurst has funded since we began that in the 1920 school year. It generally serves about 20 to 25% of our graduating seniors. Excuse me, where each graduating senior that participates in that program graduates with obviously their high school credit, but also college credit to around 18 to 21 credits as they walk out the door free of cost to them. That's in a partnership with Worcester State University.
The, you know, the Robinson Broadhurst cycle, funding cycle, request cycle, runs behind what's convenient for a lot of places. So I'm wondering, is this hinging on money they've already granted the schools or on money that we've requested?
Great question. That's money that's requested at this time.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I will only add that, speaking on behalf of a number of the school committee members, I'll point out that this is an area of pride where we are proud of the administration. If you think about the Robinson Broadhurst mission and what those funds do for our town and the couple of other towns that it supports, the idea of using Robinson Broadhurst funding for experiential learning, right, for expanding the opportunity for students in our district to experience learning in different ways other than in the classroom, we believe not only meets the mission of the Robinson Broadhurst better, but is a better use of the funds for the district. And so this is something that we're really proud of the administration having been able to do that in this budget.
Great. Thank you.
So our next slide outlines our anticipated enrollment per grade for next year. These numbers are based off of the student enrollment as of October 2022. These are the numbers that are used to calculate our foundation enrollment in Chapter 70 formula from the state and DESE based on our October 1 SIMS report. As you can see, the total enrollment for the district is increasing. We are seeing an increase in some of the younger age students. It's not so significant that we need to add a significant amount of staffing to meet the needs of your class sizes. However, we are seeing enrollment increase, which is unusual, in this part of the state, but it's good news.
Mr. King, could I ask for next year's budget that these slides be included? It would be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Sure, absolutely.
It just, turning around and then these are making a little more sense
Makes
of the
sense.
budget. It would help.
Absolutely, we can put
Thank
that
you.
in terms of what we distribute.
Yeah.
My pleasure. So just to kind of speak to some of this as well, we put up here the number of sections, which is really a reflection of the number of, I would like to call it homeroom teachers,
Yeah.
if you will, at those grade levels. We don't do that in the upper grades, just especially high school is such a different, it works so differently than any of the other grades. And this isn't, we don't want people to think that this is tied in, that necessarily grade 2 will have 5 teachers or this grade 5 will have 4 teachers. It's really up to the principal's discretion, but it just kind of gives you a placeholder gives you an idea of what class sizes are in general, but at the end of the day, it's the principal's discretion as to how to distribute their teachers. There's certainly more teachers than that. This doesn't address allied arts teachers and those types of things, special educators, but this would be sort of more what we would consider the traditional homerooms across the district.
Absolutely. So for grant awards, again, we're doing level funding for our FY '24 estimate based off your FY '23 grant allocations. Again, we are seeing an increase in enrollment, particularly in high-need subgroups. So we do anticipate there could be a slight increase in the Title I entitlement allocations there for some of your ESSER fundings, just because of that economically disadvantaged number going up. But to be conservative, we stay level funding for FY '24 on grant allocations. Just to speak a little bit about key takeaways, and then we can certainly get to the summary page of the budget. For FY '24, we're looking at the addition of 2 special education teachers, as well as including 1 special education teacher that was previously ESSER funded. Those positions are to address some of our substantially separate classroom needs. Again, looking at sort of several years of out-of-district enrollment going up, meeting the needs of some of those students who really need specific programs. Mr. King spoke a little bit last night about the structure of our substantially separate classrooms last night, and how the classroom is one class regardless of diagnoses and particular needs. And so looking at adding a second classroom to each building really helps to hopefully prioritize the individual needs of those students.
Yeah, so just to be more specific, and if we can tie this to sort of the circuit breaker conversation we just had and sending students out of district, which is a great expense. If you just want to take a teacher and kind of put them in the middle of the whole pay structure there and call that $68,000 for a teacher that could certainly, in a room like this, the maximum number of students you could have in what we call a substantially separate program would be 10 students. But if you think about those 10 students going out of district, that's $650,000 minimum. So what we're trying to do is build up our substantially separate program and offset some of those out-of-district placements. It's not going to be an immediate turnaround, if you will. So, you might hear that we're going to add these teachers and think, oh, that's great, we can bring some of these students who are currently out of district back in district. That very rarely happens. Once a student gets placed out of district, even if you bring programming in, it's very rare for a family to return. And they have a voice in that. And that's okay.
And sometimes it's not good for them to return because they're in their comfort zone and that's what they need.
It's what they need, and it's we can't change the experiences that a family had in district and all, whatever that is, and it's fine. But what we're trying to do is address the ongoing need going forward. So as some of these students graduate out, if you will, they graduate just like any other student. And so as they move through that out-of-district placement, our plan is to improve our substantially separate programming so that we don't have to place as many going out, and we can start offsetting that cost going forward. And to Ms. Babinski's point, we currently have, when we talk about substantially separate programs, we talk about severe needs. A very simple example of a way to explain this is we have 1 classroom at every building. We call it the ALL program. It stands for something which is, I can't remember. But it's more, the way I think about it is, it's more importantly, it's the way we treat it, is that all students who have sub-separate needs go into this one program, and we're not actually serving the needs of those students in the best possible way. So if you want to think about it as, we have some students who are verbal and some students who are nonverbal. The way that we would serve those students are very different. However, right now, those are just 2 examples of the students that might be in one all classroom where there might be 10 students. We might also have students that have behavioral needs and so on. And so we're not doing the greatest job of addressing those individual needs. So what we're trying to do is build out our programming so that we can have classrooms that actually address specific needs. And it would usually be an obstacle for a smaller district, quite frankly. And this is where SOA intended funds to be spent, was to address these types of needs. You go into a larger district, it's not been a secret. I came here from Lowell. I had The building that I was a principal in had 4 very specific sub-separate programs for very different needs all in one building. We have 1 classroom, and everybody goes in there. So we're trying to build that out, and it'll better serve our populations. So we will add, those are 2 additionals, and as Ms. Babinski said, we have 1 person that is currently funded in ESSER that we had hired earlier for those needs, and we will bring that person back in to the general budget. We've seen a nursing need increasing the size due to our reorganization at the middle school. You know, there's going to be an extra grade. We are going to add a separate middle school nurse. We have 1 nurse that serves that whole building, Murdoch, the middle school and the high school today. We also have the Haywood Clinic. But in accessing the nurse at Haywood Clinic is a very specific route. That nurse doesn't just address a student who comes in with a runny nose or a bloody nose or gym or whatever that happens to be. The Haywood Clinic does not serve that purpose. So we do see the need for a middle school nurse, and we're also moving to bring that on through this budget. All of these would be in the general budget and out of ESSER.
Absolutely. We are also seeing a foundation budget increase of almost 10%, and on the next slide, we'll sort of highlight, you know, it's wonderful we got $1.8 million, where is it going specifically? So we'll kind of go through that. The dean positions, this is specifically at Memorial and Murdoch Middle for next year, have been elevated to assistant principals. We spoke a little bit last night just to sort of clarify the roles. The primary difference between a dean and assistant principal has to do with their assignment, as far as deans particularly work on student needs and discipline, whereas assistant principals have the ability to also work with teachers, evaluate, and whatnot. So it goes to your high-quality education in cultivating high-quality teachers. I don't know if you want to add anything about, okay. Identifying line items specific for needs that we know that we have that weren't previously highlighted. The example that I gave here was custodians and facilities. So we know that every year we have custodians who are just in one example, being paid overtime. We have alarm calls, we have plowing needs, we have shoveling needs, and yet the cost for those were being taken right out of the salary line item. So really trying to identify what the needs are. I think you may have seen in each individual budget, we did put in specific number of hours for example, for summer help, for overtime, as well as substitutes for custodians. Just as a start, we'll assess this next year, but this is sort of what we're seeing as best as we can pull, you know, sort of through the history of what we should anticipate. For example, we may see one year, we may see additional hours for shoveling, like this year, but the following year it might be very cold, so they might not be coming in for shoveling, but we're getting a lot more alarm calls for boilers and whatnot. So we want to make sure that those costs are accounted for. Yes.
So, and one other thing, and we've talked about this probably with you all in the past couple of years, one of the things with our past budgets is we've never been able to project very well. So it's been very difficult to budget for a coming year. And what I mean by that, how that's happened, I guess, is important, is that, you know, we get to the end of the year, and the school budget is really a bottom line budget. But what we're, quote unquote, allowed to do, let's say we get to the end of the year and we've got money left in some particular item around facilities, you know, and there's a lot of money left there. We might get to the end of the year, and instead of making transfers to put the money in the right place and then charge something to the correct place, it's been common practice in the past to just say, just put it where the money is. So then when it comes time for budgeting, we try to say, well, how much should we budget for whatever that particular activity is? Overtime is the example here for the next year. We have no way to do it. We can go into, I don't know, you know, just the maintenance line for a particular building, and there's can be a number of things in there that have nothing to do with maintenance. And so what we've tried to do over the past couple of years is do a much better job of making sure that when we charge things into Munis, that they're charged to the actual places that they belong, so that when we get to this point, we can do a better job projecting and budgeting. So I'm pretty happy to say that we've made a lot of improvements and that we're able to do that a little bit this year. And so you're seeing some of these changes. These percentage changes are really, they're probably not reflective of how the money was spent in the past in actuality, but we're able to budget for that and project it better this year, and then that helps us with our end-of-year reporting, of course, as well. It's much more accurate and I think productive in terms of how we budget and how we run our district, so.
Mr. Chair? I think, Mr. King, that we just talked about this at our last meeting when we went through, like, the substitutes at or custodian subs, a negative $2,500, sped summer, negative $12,000, memorial overtime custodians, minus $6,000. So to hear you address it just answered all the questions that we had when we looked at this. But you're right, if you don't put it into the right account, you don't know what you spent. You can't possibly do a decent budget.
No. And that was the struggle the last year, to go back and look. So I really had this vision in my head last year. I was like, here, we're going to do this right. I'm going to go back, I'm going to pull it, I'm going to say, how much did we spend on whatever, HVAC? And then you go into the HVAC line to see what we spent, and there's lots of other things in there because there was money left over. Maybe we did something for field maintenance, and that's where the money was, and so it's allowed to be popped in there. And so it became really, really difficult to forecast. So we've tried really hard to do a much better job of that. But the other piece to what you're describing as well, and I don't want this to be interpreted as a negative on the town side, but there's been staffing issues on the town side. So some of the pieces that you're also seeing is we are charging to those places,
Right.
and they're going negative, and we're asking for transfer of funds, if you will, but they're behind, and we know that, and we're not pushing them, but there are negatives in the budget, and we've presented to the school committee a different format as well that Ms. Babinski has come up with, where we're sort of looking at our own accruals and whatnot, and being able to forecast exactly where the money is being spent and how. But it's lagging behind in Munis just because we know they're backlogged in terms of
Well, we look
of
at all
transfers
that,
and
but then we go to
reclasses.
the bottom
Yep.
line, and as long as you're within your budget, we're happy, because we know
Yeah.
you're going to shuffle it.
Yep.
But it was certainly a question we had because it popped up on each of the schools.
Yep.
All the, the custodian overtime were overdrawn. And it wasn't a pattern in previous years. So it raises the question, obviously, is something changed? Is the new contract language, or anything like that? And I realize they shovel snow, but, they haven't been difficult winters per se.
Yeah. No, we would have just charged it to another line that had
Yeah.
personnel overtime,
The-
right? I mean,
The other
it's
one
what
was
we were
increased
just,
a lot was the summer help.
Yep.
And, we had $1,000, we didn't spend any of it this year, so now we got to increase it to $6,000, and I was wondering what was driving that.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. We're trying to do a better job. If you think of what's happened here over the past year in terms of both the school side and the town side in terms of staffing, there's a lot of things that are behind and building up. And so, I think the solution has been we'll charge to those accounts. We've sort of asked for permission, if you will. So it's not easy on the school side to run an account negative. Payroll's a little bit different, but in terms of certain line items. And right now that we have a really great finance manager and director here that, we're able, and we have really confidence that we can do the things that we need to do while we're tracking those things separately, and then we can worry about moving the money to fill those voids so that we can do the end-of-year reporting in the responsible way that we should be doing. We've been sending that out, and the person that we send it out to asks a lot of questions that we don't always have really good answers for. So we're trying to get to best practice in this district and in every aspect, and finance is just one of those. And I think that what you're seeing is a reflection of trying to move to best practice, and it's a process, and we'll keep endeavoring to do that.
Well, it's certainly a best practice to charge expenses to the specific.
Correct locations. Agreed.
When it's a bottom line budget too, it is very easy just to say, doesn't matter because it's bottom line. But what you're doing and cleaning it up, I think reality could set in, because next year you go, I thought I hit that already. No, there'll be more.
Exactly. So
Absolutely, and just to explain some of the line items, that's ultimately why the budget is laid out according to the chart of accounts, in the sense that, if you're going to do the right thing, intentions are great until reality sets in. And so if we're asking the town every week to do budget transfers and whatnot because, the third grade teacher had an unpaid day, but then we had an extra fourth grade, issue or something, you're constantly doing transfers in order to keep the budget in line. And really, DESE Desi only wants to know how many regular education teachers you have per school, how many special education teachers you have per school, specialists and whatnot. And so it is difficult to look at the percentages and some of the changes with the reorganization and the chart of accounts, but it's not necessary to track it to that level. You know, we certainly have the backup to explain, you know, how many teachers are at every grade level and whatnot, but from a practicality standpoint, this makes the most sense in order to charge the right accounts consistently.
Yeah, and certainly from the, speaking for myself, I guess, but from the Finance Committee's perspective, obviously, we don't oversee your budget. They oversee your budget. But certainly, as you point out, I mean, having best practices in the financial aspects of the school is something that would be interested in watching. So when we raise questions like that, it's not to try to overstep our bound at all. It's really find out, so what changed? What happened? You know, and you know, I'm glad to hear that it has to do with trying to put the right resources in the right accounts.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Again, some key takeaways focusing on long-term fiscal sustainability. Again, we spoke to that a few times here tonight, but just really looking at your enrollment, your increase in high-need enrollment, your increase in special education, out-of-district tuition, all of these sort of high-cost areas, and it's not going to change. And so you have to do something in order to be able to serve the students the way that you should be, but also be able to afford it year to year. And then again, both Robinson Broadhurst and Murdoch Trust are fully enrichment, which was a primary goal of the committee. It was my understanding with this budget.
Can I just speak to the sustainability just very quickly on that piece as well? And we mentioned it last night, but I think it's important to repeat, which is, you know, folks, here we have a 10% increase. We got $1.8 million, and that very easily oftentimes can, you know, be, let's hire more people, which is not necessarily fiscally responsible. And so one of the things that we're always looking at is making sure that whatever we do this year is sustainable next year. Let's imagine that SOA doesn't get funded next year, and we're not looking at another 10% increase, and we're back to normal at 2% or whatever that happens to be. If we overspend in terms of full-time employees, then we're not going to be able to sustain that if they were to say, let's cut off SOA and go back to 2%. We wouldn't be able to meet our contractual obligations. So we're trying to be very intelligent about the way that we increase those numbers so that if something were to happen and the governor says, I'm not funding SOA next year, that we'll still be able to sustain the model that we have and not have to go backwards. So it's a very intentional approach.
Yeah, I think that certainly just to I guess piggyback on that comment a little bit, the new grants have increased required net school spending. So you might not get, you know, $1.5 million new dollars next year, but the $1.5 million you got this year doesn't go away.
Yeah.
Correct.
So that's the important thing to remember, is that as you look at an annual increase, it's different than a grant that you get it one year and you don't get it the next year. What do you do? And I know that you're being careful to use permanent increases to address permanent needs, so that you won't end up saying, okay, if it's only 2% and they're not going to increase it for this third year or fourth year, that 2% is something you could live with without having to dismantle everything you've put together.
Correct.
I think also what I like to hear is when you talk about, I'm going to take this money, Robinson Broadhurst, Murdoch Trust, and use it for enrichment. You're looking at student-focused ideas, not to improve the district, not just simply let's hire more people. So I kind of like the idea that you're bringing solutions and not excuses. And that's refreshing.
Thank you.
I would add to the superintendent's comments a moment ago about fiscal responsibility and ask him perhaps to provide some detail in the ways in which the district has used the federal grants. So the federal grants that came to us as a result of the federal decisions on COVID-19 support have resulted in a great deal of federal funds flowing to all towns. Right. And not all towns have been as fiscally responsible as this administration has been, using ESSER funds, for instance, for costs that would be very hard to move away from as the federal grants are ending. And here in this district, the ESSER funds certainly did hire some staff that were necessary to get us through the COVID-19 pandemic. A great example of that is nurses that were necessary during that time that you remember, where health was very much the focus of all of us, but certainly within the schools. And what you see in the FY24 budget is that some of that necessity carrying over into regular operating funds subsidized by, paid for by the state funds means that we are able to maintain that level of service to our students, while at the same time, some of the other things that were in the ESSER grant, this is where I'll turn to the superintendent to be specific, were one-time costs and were designed that way because that's the way the federal grants were awarded. They were one-time funds that that we knew would not be renewed. Would you talk a little bit about some of the things that were in ESSER that were not ongoing costs?
Sure. So, I mean, the biggest piece that we're doing in the district in general in terms of turnaround, like I'll just start with that, is the adoption of a lot of curriculum, math curriculum, all the materials, those types of things. It's not cheap to adopt a curriculum, if you will, for a math program K to 12. There's a big expense that, I think prior to the ESSER funds, teachers oftentimes rely on going out and just finding things for themselves, digging things up, making their own curriculum, doing what they need to do to kind of survive, if you will. And it's no way to run, but it's the reality of education, quite frankly, oftentimes. You get behind, you adopted a curriculum however many years ago, and it's all changed, and, well, now we can't afford new textbooks, right? So one of the things we did was invest in getting ourselves up to date and aligned with curriculum. So with texts and everything else comes a lot of training and professional development for our teachers to make sure that they can deliver said curriculum. And then the concern becomes, well, how can we maintain that, right? Of course, like, that's great, but what happens when you need a new math teacher and they didn't get that training? So along the way, and there's many examples of this around our curriculum pieces, but I'll just stick with the math, is what we did was we invested in, bringing in the professional development from the actual the folks who developed whatever the programs were, as opposed to, let's just say, Sally from 3 districts over, who's pretty good at it, right? Like, which is a typical model. We opted to say, let's bring in the folks who wrote the curriculum and deliver the professional development. But along the way, let's train some of our own folks to train going forward, sort of that train-the-trainer model. So when we bring in new folks, we can do that. So there's a number of pieces we've done around that for both math and reading. And then a couple of other really large pieces. One is a non-recurring cost would be the repair of HVAC at the high school auditorium. Right? That's a really large chunk of money that would have come to the town at some level that we're able to kind of offset. We have this money. It's allowed to be spent through ESSER. So off the top of my head, I think we have $300,000 earmarked in our ESSER grant to repair the HVAC for the auditorium, for a long-term repair, if you will. At the high school, at Murdoch's building, we have things such as a chairlift for handicap access at Toy Town, which has been an ongoing piece. You've seen it on the town ledgers for I don't know how many years, but it's not necessarily been funded. We were able to just say we can do that. Again, it was something allowed by ESSER. So those are some really big chunks that we had the opportunity. Anything you could spend money on the entitlement grants, and we thought about special education, you could spend through your ESSER grants. So instead of looking to the town to say, please spend more money on the schools through capital improvements, we had an opportunity to sort of do that now through the ESSER grants in a very kind of, I think, reasonable way, while also addressing sort of academic and educational needs at the same time. So that's what we've endeavored to do. We haven't spent all that money yet. There's a whole bid process, as you guys are all well aware, to make sure those things happen in a proper fashion. But I would say that we have on the order of almost $1 million set aside for just that type of work around HVAC, chair lifts. We have a playground for our new early literacy center. All of those things were earmarked in the ESSER grant, so they're not going to hit the general budget. Is there anything else that you were thinking of, Dr. Forsythe?
Okay, so again, with the 10% increase, we saw about $1.8 million in increased revenue in the foundation budget. And so looking at how those were allocated. Again, SOA is intended to help with the increasing benefit and fixed charges. Your economically disadvantaged, low income, high need areas like special education and ELL, as well as early literacy and some specific intervention type strategies. So we are seeing an indirect costs increase. Again, that's typical with health insurance, as well as an example I gave last night is, for example, Worcester County retirement assessment. We know that when we increase staffing and staffing needs, our assessments are going to go up in those areas. Tuition, again, we are seeing a significant increase in the approved private school tuitions as well as collaborative tuitions. Chromebooks and technology is at about 7%. That is your one-to-one devices at about 130,000, as well as some replacement of some of our ongoing district security measures. Special education services, as well as the extended school year, accounts for about 5%. That is specific. I think you may see on your district budget an increase in contractual services for special education. It was about a $70,000 increase. And looking at that, some of our students receive specialized services that we may not be able to service with staffing in the district. For example, speech and language services, OT-PT, our annual assessments, psychological assessments. So while we do have some staffing for those positions, the number of hours and minute needs may supersede a full position. And so we do contract out for a lot of those services, as well as some of the assessments that occur. In looking back at the last few years, it appears that you've been spending that amount of money, maybe just not in the right place, or allocating it towards grant funding, and those are costs that are required of the district. If a student has certain services on their individualized education plan, we need to be meeting those, and so pulling those into the operation budget. That's what I'm referring to in the special education services.
Amanda, tell me, what's the whole pie represent?
1.8 million. So that's your 10% foundation budget increase.
Okay, that's where the new money went.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Again, the three special education. The three special education teachers for programming, the middle school nurse. I know we've said this a lot, but school nurses do have a lot of screeners that they are completing as well. At the high school level, they're checking for sports, physicals, all of these kinds of things. They have to input all of that stuff in addition to seeing students every day. So we do have a high need there. An early literacy teacher, so the addition of one additional position for next year. And then for salary increases, those are all of our contractual obligations, as well as some of the smaller things like elevating deans to assistant principals. You actually have quite a few long-time teachers, which is excellent. So the longevity, things like that are increasing. All your steps and COLAs, that accounts for the remainder there.
Mm-hmm.
This is the FY23 revolving fund. So just sort of where we predict our balances will be at the end of the year. Specific to school choice and circuit breaker, we obviously know what those receipts are going to be this year at this point in the year based on what DESE has allocated for us, and then our estimated expenditures. Again, that's where you'll see the large increase in your circuit breaker receipts for next year. You are in a position currently where with circuit breaker, what you receive 1 year, you're eligible to hold on to for a year. So in the sort of perfect planning scenario, districts are spending what they received the previous year. That way you're able to budget and plan, and you're holding on to the receipts from that year, which you plan to use the following year.
Is that the FY24?
Yes.
Yeah. Not FY23.
It's the current
It's the
funds.
current year,
and
I'm
we're-
sorry.
Yeah, and we're projecting what the balance will be on on July 1 of '23, which would be
The
FY
estimated
'24, that
balance
final
is what-
column.
The estimated receipts of circuit breaker, 73.4, that's for estimated receipts for.
For this current year. No, that's what we're receiving this year.
23.
Correct. Correct.
That then becomes part of the revenue for FY '24.
It actually becomes part of the revenue for FY '23, and we could spend it in FY '23 or FY '24.
So the
Okay.
balance is FY '24, what you're
Correct.
projecting.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. So right now, I think Munis is only showing one received payment in the end of October of about $184,000. You are anticipating a second quarter, third quarter, and fourth quarter payment of the same amount. That makes sense. So here you should have your summary page. This is included in your packet as well. So for next year, we are seeing an increase in Chapter 70, up to 14 million. The local aid requirement increased to 6.1 million. We are anticipating an override additional contribution from the town of 50,000 for a total local and state funding of 20,180,691. So with that, you can see some of your additional,
And all but the 50,000 is required minimum net school spending.
that's correct. That's correct. All but 50,000.
Of those revenues, is the Chapter 70 and the local aid equal the required minimum net school spending?
I can skip ahead.
That, yeah. So I guess the point there being, if you subtract out the 50 and if you look at 23, you subtract out the 365. In other words, it's the contribution from the town above the required minimum contribution the town has to make. And that still results in a significant increase. I'm just trying to point that out, that, that the efforts to fund the schools adequately has, in many ways, they're doing what the town did 8 years ago when it voted the 300,000, because we weren't funding the schools adequately. So we added that money to do it. And now I'm just pointing out that the state is picking up its part of that. And so that the playing field is a little different than it was 8 years ago when the practice of the town was just to fund the minimum.
One of the things I mentioned last night, which I think is a significant point, is, for years they were advocating for the Student Opportunity Act. We knew that the formula was coming, and so a lot of communities knew that they were going to be seeing a significant increase in their revenue for Chapter 70 and their required net school spending, and so we've done the exercise many, many times. And while you're seeing an enrollment increase sort of slowly, you did see a significant increase in your high needs subpopulations, which I don't know that the town would have been able to predict back when SOA was originally being funded. So this is something that the town really does have to figure out, whereas some other communities knew, okay, well, we know that our local contribution is going to be going up 6%, and so they could sort of do a 5-year, 10-year projection as to how to meet those needs. Even 3-4 years ago, I don't know that you would have been able to predict such a large increase in your foundation budget, just due to what the formula does in addressing some of those high-need
Right, right.
populations.
It's, the challenge for the town
It is.
is, you know, we recognize that the state's increasing Chapter 70 in minimum net school spending to the tune of 8%, 10% a year. Well, that means the town's contribution rate is going to go up that, you know, in a similar percentage.
Correct.
And the only space there is to negotiate that was that $300,000.
Yes.
You know, a community that is already spending 20% more than they need to spend, or required to spend, I should say, not need, but required to spend on education. As the state picks up its part, it's got all that 20% to work with in terms of balancing it out so that that community on the town side, those numbers are gonna drop. But if you haven't got any space, there's no place to negotiate that. So I'm pleased to see that we took the steps that we did this year, and that's why I say it's gonna be 1 year at a time
Correct.
as we try to figure out how to make this equitable, so.
We also have to remember that 4 or 5 years ago, the town was digging itself out of a huge deficit. So we're behind the 8 ball, even breaking even. We managed to do that. Now we have to work on the school.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I think it has come a long way. We're just not there.
I would add that it is rare to find a school board or a school administrator that would seek minimum net school spending.
Yeah.
The funding that we are seeing from the state and from the town now is certainly more than the town has experienced and the schools have experienced in the past, but still represents close, very close to minimum net school spending. And the goal that I think we all share is finding a way to not be that town that is spending 20% more than net school spending, but certainly is contributing to the education of our young people in a way that is beyond what the state has said is legally mandated of us.
But still have money for roads and water and septic and all those other things that the town needs just to survive. Because, as I
And it
said,
allows-
we dug out of a huge hole, and
That's
It
right.
allows flexibility in your budgeting.
Right.
So if if you're a town that's 20% over, you might say, well, you know, this year, we're not going to be able to contribute as much, you know, so we'll be 18% over. You've got that area to work with, but if you're 1% over, once you've gone through
No
that
wiggle room.
1%, you're done.
Mr. Chair, can I,
Larry?
I know it sounds 20% over minimum what you're asked, but minimum is minimum.
No,
And when we talk about the lowest 8 school districts in the Massachusetts, 5 years ago, we were one of those 8. We spent 1.7% over the minimum 5 years ago. Narragansett next door to us spent 7. Athol spent 7. Oakmont spent 12. Move a little further east, and Avon spent 33%.
right.
West Boylston was, when you and I were there, was spending almost 30% higher. So my point being is I don't want us to ever give the impression that we just want to do the minimum.
Right.
We don't want to be, so if we're at 20% now, all our effort should be at keeping it at 20%. You know, I understand the economic things, and that we may not be able to maintain that, but I just want to be on record as saying I don't want us to think that, well, we used to be at minimum and we were fine. No, we weren't fine.
Weren't fine.
We weren't fine.
Right.
So we don't want to be at minimum. We want to be competitive with at least the 4 schools around us and everybody else, because I think that is what somewhat contributed to the flight of people to other school districts. They left here because we just weren't meeting the needs of our students. Well, minimally, we were, but
Or the formula that was flawed.
yeah, the formula was definitely flawed, and that's helped a lot that they changed. Of course, so I took the introduction when I got on the school committee for the, for the formula, and the woman started it out by saying, "There's only 10 people in the entire state that understand the formula, so if you're confused, don't worry about it when you leave here today." So I think, they've done a lot to try and improve the formula, and that's been great. But again, my point being, I just don't want us to think that somehow we're overspending. We're not overspending. We're trying to bring things up to snuff where they should be for our students and the needs of our students. And that's the bottom line. And with that, I'm going to have to apologize because I'm facilitating another meeting, so I've got to leave. But thank you for all your efforts. And I said this last night, I can't, and I think you echoed it tonight, Tom, and Mo, you too. And, I mean, I just am thrilled of the work that the superintendent and the business manager have done. Tom and Amanda have done a great job of not only being fiscally responsible, but putting the money into programs that meet the needs of students. Yeah. How ridiculous was it to spend Robinson Broadhurst money on pens and pencils? Yeah. I mean, the whole approach to giving kids an experiential education is certainly a lot more valuable than paying for paper and whatnot. So that kind of approach, student-centered, but still being responsible, it's a breath of fresh air. In the 7.5 years I've been on the board, it's really taken some time. So I thank you, and I'm sorry that I have to leave, but I'm sure that whatever questions you throw at them, they've got the answers, because we threw a bunch of questions at them too, and
But
they
I
did a
think
great
you're
job.
right, Larry. When you can do what Mr. King has done and say, this is how this is going to benefit kids, it's not about I want more money because West Boylston got it. It's because
Yeah.
this is my need.
Yeah.
And that's what we're hearing, and that's what I appreciate.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Larry.
Good night.
May I just identify one practical, I'll defer to
No,
you,
no.
Mr.
Mr. Chair, I don't want to be the skunk at the garden party here, but as pleased as I am with the budget, I have to tell you, and I hope you bear with me, I was up all night thinking about this school budget and my vote in support of it. Not that I would change my vote. I think that Thad and Amanda did a fantastic job on this. What I was thinking all night about was that move of the override money from the schools to the town side. And when it was first passed, when the override was passed, the voters had the understanding that that was what this would be for. And ever since that override was passed, some folks in town, I should say, have just been anxious, let's put it that way, to see those funds diverted from the school district to the town. And not that I don't understand that, but as a member of the school committee, I realize I have a commitment to the taxpayers and to the town, but I feel that my main commitment is to the students of the district. And one of the things, when I was serving on the Revenue Sharing Committee, that I was sort of adamant about was a commitment that if and when the Student Opportunity Act funds are no longer coming this way from the state. And I believe it's supposed to sunset in 26?
There's 3 additional years beyond this year.
Yeah, okay. What I was looking for, quite frankly, was a commitment that when those funds go away, that the town manager and the town government board of selectmen would commit to seeing that those funds are funneled, all of those funds are funneled back to the school district. And there was talk, Justin said he would commit to that. Thad said he would work with Justin on that. My concern is Thad could, as recent history has shown, Thad, for all we know, could be gone by the end of the year. And I don't know, how long Mr. King is going to be here, hopefully a good long time. But I guess it just concerns me that, and to be honest with you, I have no idea how you would do this, because I know it's the town meeting that decides what to do with these monies. But I would like to see that commitment somehow memorialized so that it's on record that these commitments are being made for future town managers, future boards of selectmen, future school committees, as to what the town officials at this time were thinking when we did move that Prop 2.5 money from schools to the town. We talk about wanting to get above net school spending. And while we've got a great influx of cash right now this year, and maybe for the next couple of years, there's no guarantee that that's going to be there. And we know, and again, the SOA is scheduled to sunset in not too many years. I've talked to Senator Comerford, and she has tried to assure me that it's not going away, but
You can't guarantee
there's
it.
no guarantee.
Oh.
And so I just, call me naive. Maybe it's a silly proposal, but as my grandkids can tell you, I look silly all the time. And I don't know what kind of an agreement Thad and Justin could hammer out, what kind of a document. To be honest with you, I don't even know exactly what I'm looking for. But I would like to see something put down in black and white that this is what the town officials at this place and time were intending to do when those Prop 2.5 funds were moved. I guess I'm done.
I think you'll remember that your group, your committee, our committee, and the Board of Selectmen assigned representatives to the cost and revenue sharing group that met. When that group finished its work, as Greg was describing, it really settled on putting to writing an agreement between the schools and the town for what would happen in this current fiscal year, where obviously things are quite unique and different than last year, and what would be expected in the future years. Our expectation is that the superintendent and the town manager, while they've begun to put understandings to writing currently to prepare us for the FY24 budget, that a greater commitment would be made between the town and the schools to have a plan for what would happen in out years.
That's my understanding, too.
And that plan, it would be expected that plan would be in the mutual benefit of the town and the schools, and certainly contingent upon what happens in those out fiscal years.
But I'd like them
Mr.
to
Chair,
take the time to do it, not quickly, but to do it thoughtfully. Because nobody expected COVID, nobody expected $3 million deficit, a few years. So they have to think about those possibilities too. There's always an outlier. So I'm glad that they're meeting. I'm glad they've solved some things, and I just see it as all positive.
Greg?
Mr. Chair, as you said, there was the agreement. Not that I'm the only one that counts, but for my own comfort, like to see that document put together and presented before the town meeting.
Oh. Too soon.
Because that's what I say, I'd have a tough time saying vote for this if there weren't some assurances on what's going to happen in the future, but I'm one person, so.
Well, I won't speak for, I think he left. I don't know if he was still in here. I saw the town manager pop in for just a second, and I don't want to speak for Mr. Solzback, but we're committed to continuing to work together to put together, you know, a plan that gets us past sort of the SOA window, if you will. You know, there's certainly not a waterfall event at the end of that. The money is not, the money that we're receiving is not going away. This is money that we will keep, you know, permanently, and then we'll go back to sort of probably, and we don't know what the future holds. I don't know what the funding, they might change the Chapter 70 model again, you know, when SOA is over. Who knows?
As soon as you understand it, they'll change it.
Yeah, if you just accept that it's always going to change, you're in a good spot. But, you know, we're committed to putting something together that gets us past that and also gets, I think we try to think about this as the community and not the towns versus the schools, right? And so in an intelligent way, and I think, Dr. Ward, you were the one that proposed it last year, and I brought it forward in the committee, which is, let's take some small bites out of this as we go. We don't have to get to, if we're looking to get to 5% over net school spending, we don't have to get to that today. But we need a plan that gets us there, and if we take small bites out of it along the way, then we can get there. But we have to plan for it thoughtfully. And so thoughtfully meaning let's take into account the SOA funds, but also take into account what that's going to look like afterwards and what that looks like, you know, trying to project out 3 years from now, what does the school budget look like? So if we continue to assume that we get this 10% increase each year, so where would we be, and what does 5% above that look like 3 or 4 years from now? It's not about what 5% looks like today, it's what 5% looks like then. So we've done some rough estimations, we documented in that letter, that probably looks like an additional $1 million beyond what the override funds are when we get to FY 20, I think 8, off the top of my head, right? So those are just our rough estimates and trying to forecast out what SOA might do. So, you know, looking at that from that perspective, we need to come up with a plan together to say, how can we get there? How can we get to that extra $1 million beyond that override in a thoughtful way that doesn't hurt either side, right? I'd like to identify, and I think we're both, Mr. Solzback and I are committed to doing that, and I think we will. I don't know. I'm not gonna speak for him before town meeting. I would love to see that too, but I don't know that we can get there. But yeah, I think the sooner the better is clear. I think we would all be at ease. Because we have this same conversation every year. And I think we would all like to not have the conversation anymore, right? But also be at ease that no matter what happens, we at least have something in writing instead of constantly referencing the gentleman's agreement, what was said at some particular meeting and so on. Let's get it memorialized in some way that, you know, that at least we have some satisfaction in knowing that and we don't have to have this conversation every year.
But even some of the changes, like our cannabis revenue, we have no idea what that's going to be. Hopefully it's significant. The solar revenue, that's, I understand, has gone to the attorneys because there was a warrant article passed in 2016, I believe, so that was never brought to fruition. So is that valid? Do we have to go back to the town to rescind it? We don't know yet, those things. So that's why I'm saying I don't think those can be answered before this town meeting, but I think the commitment is there to make sure we have something solid that we can all agree to that will work for the community, as you say, not for one side. There's no sides. It's a community.
Mr. Chair, I was going to say, as long as the community understands that that's what we're working for, you know, maybe the document isn't needed before town meeting.
Well, I think you have
But-
the support of the groups now, which we didn't before.
I think it's important that the voters know.
I don't want to belabor this, but I want to identify one very practical concern I have around net school spending, minimum net school spending, and the $50,000 above that we currently have. And we talked about this in that sort of subcommittee or working group. The governor's budget is not finalized. And if numbers move in a particular fashion that say the money that's been provided to the town, to the schools, is under 100%, right? If it gets to 99%, if something moves, the town will be penalized next year, right? To the tune of whatever net school spending is, whatever the required local contribution is, plus what was underfunded this year. So if it was 1%, whatever that math adds up to, let's say it's $200,000, the town would be on the hook for that as a penalty in the following fiscal year. And I just want to identify that as a practical concern, that $50,000 doesn't allow much wiggle room in terms of a finalized budget from the governor if it moves. I mean, if history serves, maybe it doesn't move at all. However, it's a new governor. And so I'm just pointing it out as a practical concern that it is playing a little bit of a risky game, that it's leaving a very, very small window of opportunity there for us to sort of escape. So I think it's important that everybody understands what that looks like going forward.
There is a good amount of advocacy happening as the FY24 budget on the state level is being finalized. Right now, we only have the governor's House 1 budget, which has resulted in significant increases in education funding across the board, early childhood, higher education, K-12. But the legislature has not matched that budget or countered that budget to the greatest extent yet. And there is a good deal of advocacy happening. The town manager from Athol, as an example, testified on behalf of small towns that were adversely affected by the Student Opportunity Act and the way in which that drew extra funds from the town's operating budget, and therefore is advocating for additional local aid in the subsequent budgets that will likely come from the legislature. Earlier, Senator Comerford was mentioned, who is one of the strongest advocates in the Senate for increased local aid for exactly this purpose. So as early as FY24, we could see increased amounts of funding coming from the state to the town, not necessarily for the purposes of matching net school spending requirements, but instead being realistic about the fact that the change in SOA is affecting towns and their ability.
Yeah.
If that doesn't happen for FY24, as long as state receipts continue to be positive, it's possible it could be for FY25, 26, and beyond,
Yeah.
as SOA continues to affect us.
Okay.
What else you got?
I mean, basically, you can see the summary page here. You have your net local and state funding, the additional sources. Again, the most significant pieces there is noticing the increase in circuit breaker revenue, noticing that we are anticipating some rollover from our FY22 and FY23 grants, as well as pulling out the trusts from the operational budget. That with your grant revenue, you have a total estimate revenue that matches your expenses based on projected salaries and expenses. So I am anticipating that there would be some questions about the specific budget. I don't know if you want to just kind of cut to that piece. Our presentation is primarily done here just with the summary of the indirect costs. And then again, I was just going to point out the required net school spending is the total here minus or less the 50,000. So, but that's already been discussed.
When I went through the line items page by page, I was really happy to see the corrections on like the custodial overtime, the paras and all those. The only one that I had a little concern about was the Toy Town custodial substitutes. You have increased it by 1,080, but my year-to-dates from March 1st say you're in the hole 2,500. So you might want to check that one, and it might be an anomaly. There might be somebody out sick for a long term. That, you know, it could be anything. Just it jumped out.
Yes, we did have some staffing changes as far as assignments, and so we do believe that will be corrected for next year. Yes, thank you.
He's thinking.
I saw him sharpen his pencil.
While we're waiting, there was one thing that was stated last night by one of the school committee members that I just wanted to correct on camera, because she said that the wastewater went up 11%. It's 3% for the coming year. So you're good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll just address very quickly, and I think that Ms. Babinski sort of addressed it as well, but just the increase in percentage in the special ed contractual services from 3,000 to whatever that number is. And I know that you obviously watched last night, but I addressed this, but just to be clear, speech and language pathology is a huge need across the district, like it is in almost all districts, quite frankly, especially at the younger grades. It also has become one of the most difficult types of services to locate.
Anyone's looking for a second career,
Yeah.
go into
Oh, my
speech and
goodness.
language.
So not only do we not have folks that we need any longer, our local collaboratives, where we, not only do we send students to our collaboratives, we also rely on them for services. So we can get contractual services from them, like speech and language. They also don't have folks at this point. But my point being is over the past couple of years, we've had open positions on our budget attempting to hire, and instead we've been outsourcing and doing contractual services, and we've been charging those to the actual the salary lines, and so we've made the move this year just to move that money right into those contractual services. So it explains away, I don't know, the huge percentage increase. It's not actually an increase in spending, it's just putting it where we're actually spending it, like we've done on some other
Yeah,
things.
it's
But
not going to bounce
I felt it
back.
was important that it was kind of clearly identified since it's such a huge number.
And one of the requirements with your end of year report, as well as all of your grants, is something called maintenance of effort, which basically says that you're going to spend at least as much as you've done previously to address special education needs within the district with your local and state funding resources. And so, obviously there's caveats to that. For example, if you had a significant decrease in enrollment, or a teacher, if you're a smaller district and you have a teacher that's at the top step in special education, you hire, she retires or something like that. There are a few caveats, but mainly you have to meet maintenance of effort in order to maintain your grant allocations and your entitlement grant allocations. And so making sure that they're in the right buckets is important for a multitude of reasons, particularly maintenance of effort. So if you're using those funds and offsetting with grants, or having it come out of salary line items, you do want to make sure that it's earmarked for special education. And so just making sure that that's really happening for some of those requirements.
Amanda, I get a little confused on what's on our package, page 2. It lists the cost centers, district-wide early learning center, memorial, total budget request for each of those. So I know that's the totals that are broken down later in the detail. So the total expenses of the schools are almost $19 million, let's say. And then you added the indirect costs. And then we've got a trust and the TBD. I guess what I'm wondering is that the total expense of $22,927,000, $22 million, $23 million, let's call it. Here we go. It doesn't jive with any of the numbers on the first page. So I realize that I guess what I'm wondering about is on the first page, if we look at the $16,983,000.
So for example, if you were to take on the first page, the total estimated revenue of $19,729,000,
Yeah.
and you actually add in your indirect costs,
Yeah.
that's where you're going to get that $22,927,000 number.
Okay. And I guess that doesn't, I guess what I was looking for was something that would jive with the general fund. So the general fund basically is $16,983,000. That's on the first. The total state and local funding.
Yeah, this is something that we discussed recently is the previous budget had allocated per line item whether the funding was coming from the general fund versus some of your offset funding sources, and that is not outlined in this budget. It does make sense. I certainly know off the top of my head what each offset account is allocated for. You know, for example, circuit breaker has to go through for special education and in specific caveats. You know, your Title I grant has to go for intervention and you know, really meeting your ESSA guideline requirements. But it would be transparent to have that outlined in the budget. And so we did discuss making sure that that's in there moving forward.
Yeah, one of the things that I talked with Dad a little bit before the meeting. It's funny because I told him, I said, listen, I'm going to mention all these things that aren't in our packet, but they were all on the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Good.
we just need them ahead of time. But in the past few years, the presentation would show the cost, what was coming out of the general operating budget, which is, you know, when we get year-to-dates, that's what that is. And then what's coming out of circuit breaker, what's coming out of Chapter 1 monies, what's coming out of, you know.
The spreadsheets where we
Yeah,
have the columns.
yeah, which then bring us, I guess, to that total of $18,900,000.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. And so what's not shown on that second page that you're referring to is in funding sources. For the circuit breaker line, there's a line several columns over that sort of identifies, you know, 532,000 of that is going to go towards collaborative tuition, and 200,000 may go out of private school tuition. Same thing with your Title I offset is at 356,878, and it does outline exactly where those salaries correlate to the budget. So moving forward, we'll make sure that we share that with you know, sort of clearly on the budget. Yeah, it does make sense.
Because I think it's an important thing in that if we look at it and say, well, it's $19 million, the town and the state are coming up with $16 million. The other $3 million comes from grants, trusts, other donations to the school that every district has to be able to put together the program that they need to put together. So I think that it's important for the town to know that, you know, the total cost of education is more than what we see in the town warrant. It's a lot more. So I think highlighting where that money goes and how that is spent has some value to it.
Absolutely.
I think at the end of the day, when Ms. Babinski was creating the budget, she's smarter than I am, Tom. And I had to think like a very common person to figure out all the money and where it's supposed to live. And she does this all the time. So I think it's also a reflection on her abilities that she's really able to do that, and I'm not. So as much as you like that spreadsheet, that was a necessity on my part. So
Well, as I said, I mean, I think it's been a very informative overview of the budget. I think we had some great discussion. So I didn't mean that as a criticism, just as a point that there's, that illustrates part of a big piece of the pie that doesn't show up in the general fund.
It's hard to change what we're used to.
But it is good feedback, you know, certainly when it's something that you're doing all of the time and you're trying to, you know, present it to a committee that doesn't do it every single day. I mean, this is literally what you hire me to do. It is important feedback, and, you know, as soon as Mr. King said it, you know, of course, it makes sense, you know, sort of spell it out there. So I do appreciate the feedback, absolutely.
Any questions?
They're all glazed over going. I truly appreciate, I can't stress enough how happy I am that it's kid-focused and you have solutions. It's great.
thank you.
Motion to adjourn?
Yeah, any questions or any comments from, I realize that
This is their
warmed
second
over
run through.
leftovers for you guys.
I ought to say I feel a little less apprehensive than I did before. Maybe not completely, but a little less.
Okay.
Greg
Good,
was saying,
good.
could we just do this once next year instead of twice? 7:04, motion to adjourn?
Second. Mr. Chair,
Greg,
motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
motion?
Aye.
Second? All in favor on the school committee side? Aye.
Our page will be distributing the